Well, welcome everybody. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm joined by the wonderful EP Stavs, a fellow fantasy author, and I'm so happy to have her with us today. This is the first author interview I've done for my channel, so you're in a place of honor, Erin.
I'm so excited.
Right. Well, first, could you please introduce yourself to my listeners and subscribers? Just give us a brief overview of who you are.
Okay, I'm EP Stavs. I write a lot of things, so it's kind of hard to pin down at this moment, but I have a completed YA fantasy series that is currently being made into audiobooks. And I also write gothic horror as well as more adult fantasy romance, although not too adult fantasy romance, but most of it's fantasy. I
Okay.
would say for the most part is kind of in there somewhere.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. I think, and I've personally read your Shendry series. I definitely recommend it for YA fantasy, especially like if you are into young adult fantasies with romance, then definitely check it out. And what age would you say is like an appropriate beginning age for that?
That's a good question because this came up a lot at Geek Girl Con, and I
Mm,
had a lot of young people pass by my booth. They're like, "Ooh, books!"
yeah.
And it's like that, like those 11-year-olds, and I'm like, "Oh, there's some mild language in it.
Mhm.
So, like it does say shit occasionally, and that's about it.
Okay.
And then there is some obviously violence. I don't
Mhm.
shy away from the occasional gore when appropriate. So I think it really depends on what their parents are comfortable with. Because I've had my neighbor's kids read it,
Mhm.
and she's like 10. Uh, but I'm sure other parents might be more like 13
Sure. Yeah.
plus.
Like PG-13 sort of
Yeah, I
sort of
mean the
thing.
romance is pretty clean. Also, as the
Yes.
books progress, it does get, I would say, a little bit darker. So the
Yes.
first book is very appropriate, and then maybe check back in later.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that matches my experience with reading it. Like I did like yeah, there's occasional language and I wouldn't be like the violence is like so gory, like it's really graphic in detail of like,
Yeah,
anything where I'd be like if my child read this, I'd be uncomfortable. Um but yeah, so good content warning, I suppose, for anyone who's interested in getting that for their child. But yeah, I really do think that it's worth checking out as teenage years and up.
yeah. I mean the teen readers seem to like it, so
Perfect. Well,
they're my
good.
best audience.
Yeah, definitely. So, I guess another thing that brings you here is that we both contributed a short story to a anthology called Midwinter Magic and Mayhem,
Mhm.
which I did a brief dramatic reading on this channel previously to kind of get people enticed with the story I brought, but I want to hear about the story that you wrote for Midwinter Magic and Mayhem.
Okay. First of all, I read yours and I really liked it.
Thank
Ties
you.
in really well with your series.
Thank you.
But as far as mine is unrelated to any of my books. It's just a short story I wrote. And I'd actually already written it, and then I kind of adapted it to the winter thing because I'm really into Grimm's fairy tales and stuff like that.
Mhm.
And so mine was a retelling of Grimm's The Singing Bone, which is not very well known, but I have this big, thick book from my childhood of like the complete Grimm's fairy tales. So I had come across it in there, and I was like, I kind of wanted to do a retelling of that one. And so it was supposed to be darker, and it is dark, but I have a tendency to I'm kind of cheeky when I write. I don't, it just happens. So even like these dark stories, and this one didn't even have any romance in it, which is shocking for me. But it still came out kind of more lighthearted than I planned, I guess, I think in the feel.
Mhm.
But I don't know. I had a lot of fun with it. It's a definitely a kind of a classic grim setting. I didn't veer too much from the original story, except to kind of add my own unique touches to it.
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting you say you got inspired by Grimm's tales, Grimm's fairy tales, and when I read it, I definitely enjoyed it, and I was curious what inspired it, and because I definitely got like a fairy tale feel from it, and
Mhm.
I had never heard of the was it the Singing Bone?
Singing Bone. Yep.
Yeah, I had never heard of that, so that's really cool that honestly to kind of introduce that like older literature to a newer audience. and possibly get people into Grimm's fairy tales and
Well,
seeing how dark it can
they're
really get.
weird.
Yeah,
There's some weird
yeah.
stuff in
There's
there.
some
It's, I
weird
guess,
stuff.
good for ideas.
Hmm. Right. Like I'm sure some people might have read the original Grimm version of Cinderella, and they're like, "That's not what the Disney version is like."
Right, yeah. But I'm
So
into that.
yes. Well, that's awesome. So yeah, definitely please check out. I'll be sure to put a link in the description for Midwinter Magic and Mayhem, as well as a link to your website, Erin, as and your books on Amazon, so that everyone can check out your work. Yes, exactly. And this is a new beautiful cover.
Thank you.
And I really love the new covers that you commissioned. Like I think they really bring a nice, like very fantasy feel to like, or especially young adult fantasy feel.
Yeah, I'm really happy
John.
with it. I have an amazing cover artist,
Mm-hmm.
Steffi Draws Art on Twitter, and she's actually making cover art for me right now for
Great.
my current project that'll be on Kindle Vella. So I'm
Oh,
excited to
cool.
see how that turns out, which is
Well,
also related to Grimm's fairy tales. So
well, there you go.
only with a lot more romance.
Yeah, and I think you also just published a book, Rip Viola Winkle, right?
Yep,
Or
Rest
R.I.P.
in Peace, Viola Winkle.
Yeah, and that is that also based on a fairy tale of some kind?
Rip Van Winkle mashed up
Yes.
with Beauty and the Beast, and then
Okay.
some Celtic fantasy of my own design.
Wonderful. I mean, I think that sounds like a really interesting combination. And that's another one. Is that, would you classify that as young adult as well, or older adult?
It is older adult. It was
Yeah.
originally I planned for it to be like adult fantasy romance,
Okay.
but my writing style is very YA sounding, like
Yeah.
just fast paced. And I don't know, something about it. My readers are like, "Oh, this sounds like YA, except there's some steamy scenes in here." And I'm like,
Sure.
so it's I would say maybe 16 and up. There is some fade to black
Okay.
spice in there, but
Hmm.
nothing too over the top.
Nothing explicit, I guess, right?
A few swear words thrown in there. The little
Sure.
bit, it's definitely a step above the Shendry series.
Okay. Okay. Cool. So once they read all the Shendry series and they're like, age 18, 20 or so, right into Rip Viola Winkle.
Just ready for them, just right there.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, I'm a fantasy author and you're also one. I'm curious what draws you to that genre to write with.
Well, I mean, it's so imaginative. It's so much fun, and I just like being able to kind of come up with my own rules and stuff for what I want to do. Although I do tend to write in more of like a fairy tale fantasy style.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's kind of what I've always liked growing up. So less epic fantasy and less high fantasy. Although I enjoy those, I like to kind of, I don't know. I like that kind of mysterious, magical fairy tale vibe.
Yeah, I certainly get that. And I would agree that uh fairy tales do present like such a unique part of our culture, and it's cool to see like that trend continuing or like almost revitalized perhaps. Like it seems like there's a fairly recent trend to kind of be back into fairy tales or fairy tale retellings, and I think that's really
Yeah.
cool. Real.
Especially kind of turning them like some of the old patriarchal kind of concepts that are in there and then kind of turning them around and turning them on their head and making them a little bit more modern day. I like that.
Yeah, and like kind of or even just introducing some new concepts of, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but yeah, just kind of like updating how things might apply now in our day and age with a fairy tale. Because I guess to me, fairy tales present often like an age old sort of lesson or moral to the story that might help us understand the world. But obviously, those things have to adapt to how we live in the current world. Like we're not living in the 18th
Yeah.
century or with, we have lots of technology and all that stuff. So definitely need to have some new ways to look at it.
Yeah. And some of those morals weren't like so great. Like some of the
No.
stories were like lessons to like design like to keep women in line or and stuff like that, such as like Bluebeard and all those. And you're kind of like,
Right. Or
what's
like
the message here? And you're like, well, I don't care for that.
or like just
We
kind
do
of this sort of a authoritarian sort of attitude in general of like it's, again, I can't think of an example off the top of my head right now, but like I guess something that comes to mind is in Cinderella, just kind of like some like violence in there of like holy crap, cutting off the heel of your foot to fit your shoe so you can trick this man into marrying you. Like that's
Which is kind of absurd because doesn't he remember her like a little bit
you
like
think.
bloody foot and shoved in a shoe? Wow, all right, I'll marry you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
some of that stuff I'm just like, what?
Right. Yeah, right, exactly. Perfect. So I guess another question I have for you is what obviously like you're into fantasy, so you explained why you are drawn to that, but is there anything in particular that besides fairy tales that inspires your stories?
Well, I will say that my original series, the Chandri series, was highly inspired by what I was reading before because that was the first thing I wrote was the Marked Princess.
Mm-hmm.
And I was reading a lot of Melanie Sellier, who is also an indie author,
Mm-hmm.
or at least she was at the time. I don't know if she's still indie or not, to be honest. But she's like one of those prolific authors that has just managed to somehow kind of overcome that little indie gap. And she's, now she puts books out and she has hundreds of reviews, not thousands, but like
Okay.
a lot of reviews. She obviously has a steady readership, but
Yeah.
her stories had a lot of, she did do a lot of like fairy tale retellings, but they weren't like the ones I'd read before. They were like
Mm-hmm.
in like a series. So like it was this entire fantasy world that she created. And then each story would have like a different heroine
Mm-hmm.
and a romance, because that was in there, but also like just like there would be some sort of a fairy tale tied in, but then there's this continuing story that continued throughout this kingdom and
Okay.
throughout the series. And I really liked how that kind of tied together. So there were individual stories, and you could, with that series, you could get away with reading them out of order if you
Okay.
wanted.
Mm-hmm.
With minor spoilers, as long as everyone's getting a happy ever after, it's not too much of a spoiler.
Sure.
But it was really fun just to see how it kind of progressed and how she wove that in and just her style. And it really resonated with me. And I think that came out a lot in my books and
Okay.
the way I put them together.
Yeah, I can certainly see that where you follow a different set of characters in each book, and but it all ties together into one cohesive story.
Yeah.
And that was really cool to kind of see, because I guess the premise of your story involves like these four warriors, and they work strongest when together.
Mhm.
So kind of like how do each of those women deal with their unique problems or their unique powers?
Mhm.
Yeah, I thought you did a really good job, like kind of tying that all together.
It was definitely a challenge by book 4, but
Sure.
I was really happy with how it turned out.
I totally understand the challenge of writing the final book. That's
Right?
currently what I'm working on, and I'm like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to stick the landing?
Right?
There's the pressure's on. Okay, great. So the next question I have is just what is your favorite story that you've written?
Oh, my favorite story that I've written. I mean, usually it's the one you're working on, I suppose, and that is definitely tempting. But I wrote a short story called The Drowning of Moira O'Cleary, and
Mm-hmm.
it's published in the Crow's Quill. It was the first one I had published in there back in, I think it was November of 2021
Okay.
issue. And it's like 1,500 words, and I don't know. I think that might be my favorite thing I've ever written.
Okay.
It's not a romance. It's a little dark. My
Mm-hmm.
mom read it and was like, "Whoa." But I don't know. I think sometimes those short stories end up being my favorites.
That's awesome. And just for anybody who isn't aware, the Crow's Quill is it correct to call it like a magazine or
Yeah, it's an
kind of
online
okay.
magazine that features gothic horror and dark fantasy.
Okay.
Sure.
So if that's up your alley, be sure to go check that out, The Crow's Quill, and you can read Erin's story in there. Do you remember which issue that your that short story's in?
I think that one was in, I'm gonna say it was the full moon issue, and it
Okay.
was I think November of 2021.
Okay.
And then I have 3 more in there after that, but
That's
in
so
different,
cool.
yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. And I guess to kind of wrap this up, um, can you tell us where to find more of your stuff if they're interested in reading your books or just learning more about you?
You can find all of my stuff at epstavs.com. No periods, just epstavs.com, and it's all there.
It's all there. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for joining. Was there anything that you would like to tell us about that's coming up, or any other projects that you're excited to share?
Well, I mean, mostly just I'm getting that audiobook made. I'm very excited about that. The
That's
Mark
right.
Princess, and it's being narrated by one of my favorite authors,
Mhm.
Carol Beth Anderson. And I just heard the 15-minute like past, and it was so good.
Wonderful.
She just nailed it. And I'm very excited about that coming out soon.
Yeah, I really admire Cara Beth Anderson as well, who does all her own work, and she
Right?
also takes in other people's projects, and she's just become rather a prolific audiobook narrator at this point.
Yeah.
Where she's even offered to do something pro bono, which is very kind of her.
Right? Yeah, no, she's a huge support to the indie community.
Absolutely.
But also really good. Like I've heard some audiobooks and all that make me cringe, but I'm very excited with how this sounded.
Wonderful. Well, I can't wait to hear a sample of that either. I mean, probably I'll be having a baby soon, so I might be using Audible a lot. And I guess will you plan to put it up on Audible?
Yes, and I'll have free
Perfect.
codes that I'll definitely offer to everyone in my newsletter, etc. So
Okay, great. Well, I might be listening to the Shendry series in the near future. So I'm holding a baby. Perfect. Well, thank you again so much for joining. Be sure to check out Erin's website, epstavs.com, and I'll put all the links down below in the description. And again, also make sure to check out Midwinter Magic and Mayhem to see
yeah.
her story about based off the singing bone. And you can also check out my story, of course. But
This
really,
is
we're here to let's
good.
focus on Erin for here.
Father, I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much. Again, thank you for coming, and it was wonderful to have you.
Thank you.
Woo!